Welcome, everyone. We're going to today discuss vaccines. We're talking about background, things that are important for you to know as a clinician. There's other classes that you've had where we talk about the basic science, including the immunology behind vaccines. Tonight, our major focus is practical stuff, what you're going to hear from patients. We'll talk about safety, efficacy, how we do conduct clinical trials, and the tracking mechanisms for adverse events for vaccines. We'll talk about schedules, and we'll talk most importantly about hesitancy. This is a crash course, basically, in how to interface with your patients in relation to vaccines. So let's get into the PowerPoint side of things. Okay, so why are vaccines important? Vaccines have saved more lives, probably, than almost anything except maybe clean water. We could talk about antibiotics, but the numbers are staggering. 3 million lives are saved each year worldwide by vaccines. What does that look like? What does that mean? In the United States, we have forgotten, and other places that don't have many infectious diseases because of vaccines, we have forgotten the impact. And so risk assessment is super important. And we'll talk about how to talk with patients about this, but you need to have a background and understanding of the validity of the science behind it. We could actually save 1 to 3 more millions people every year if we had effective vaccines and if we had good distribution of vaccines. Things like malaria would absolutely, a malaria vaccine would absolutely be impactful. So, and then we need to put risk of adverse events. So we'll talk about this in a little bit, but the probability of having an adverse event is 1 in 350,000. Now, those are tragic stories, and if you spend any time giving vaccines, you're going to hear about those stories. And I spend a great deal of time interfacing with these patients, these people who have had vaccine injuries, and it's tragic. But the truth is, if you compare that number versus the number of people that we save every year, it is astronomical. We save 3 million people, but that also doesn't account for the human suffering where people don't have diseases, the human productivity losses from infectious diseases. And so the numbers absolutely correspond with we need to be giving vaccines. There is no other question. It's just the most effective way of promoting human health. And this chart will show you, we used to have 207,000 cases of diphtheria. We're down to 0 because of vaccines. Measles, almost 1 million. We're down to 700. Mumps, 150,000, down to 700. Pertussis, and if you've ever heard of a baby with pertussis, it's heartbreaking, heart-wrenching. It's probably one of the most disturbing things that I have witnessed. And we're down to about 10,000 per year. Polio, 20,000 to 0. Rubella, 57,000 to 0. Tetanus, 1,500 to 10. Haemophilus influenza, 20,000 to 34. This is one that was recently, this in meningococcus. You will hear some of the old school pediatricians talk about how drastic of a change it was when we started giving this vaccine. And hepatitis B is dramatically down as well. So, and we have to talk about, when we talk about the purpose of vaccines, the purpose is to eradicate the disease. And the effect is we're going to try to control it. One thing I'll let you pause this slide, but I'd really like you to compare the outcomes from vaccines versus measles. And I'll just give the first example. 300 children a year have seizures from the MMR vaccine. That's tragic. But guess what? 10,000 children have seizures that are induced from measles. So sometimes we get our numbers conflated because those are orders of magnitude differences in between adverse events, which are tragic, but in fact, the infectious disease is way worse. We rarely give out diseases where the numbers are not orders of magnitude better in favor of giving the vaccine. You can go through some of these complications, whether they're uncommon, rare, or very rare complications. And for the most part, you're seeing very orders of magnitude better outcomes by giving the vaccine. So what kind of we're going to briefly talk about types of vaccines. This isn't something that this is actually very much a probably a topic that was discussed in IHL. But it's important to note because there's several important features that occur from this. And as you get in when talking about your patients, you're going to need to understand the difference and why we do things. There's live attenuated or killed bacteria vaccines. So BCG and cholera are examples of this. Live attenuated polio and rabies. We don't commonly give these in the United States anymore. We will commonly give subunit vaccines. Subunit vaccines, the trade-off we're going to see in a little bit is that subunits are very much safer. Live vaccines have a lot more efficacy. I shouldn't say a lot, but they have several, and we're willing to do those trade-offs because of the improved safety profile. And the trade-off is we get a little less efficacy. And subunit vaccines also are very common against some of the toxins. So tetanus toxin, diphtheria toxin, those are specifically they don't actually control the disease. They actually control the toxin that the virus or mainly the bacterias give out. Sorry, the bacterias. We have conjugate vaccines where we take carbohydrates and conjugate them to peptides that allows helper T cells to better effectively process and gives you a more durable vaccine response. We have synthetic vaccines where we take recombinant proteins, mainly recombinant protein to our DNA techniques, and put them into other viruses. We do have viral vectors, and we have DNA vaccines and RNA vaccines. So these are examples of types. Important to know which type of vaccine you're given because it has different safety and efficacy differences as you do that. Obviously, subunits are safer, but with less efficacy. Live are much more effective, but they have a higher lower safety profile. So we get a lot more adverse events. Obviously, you can imagine in children and certain groups of people like immunocompromised or some of the elderly, we have to take those trade-offs differently than we do an adult or even sometimes even adolescents. What we're presenting in a vaccine is an antigen, and the antigen is a foreign molecule that has the ability to produce humoral or cell-mediated immune response. Okay, what does that mean? So an antigen is part of a pathogen. It can be integral part, or it can be secreted like a toxin, and that is going to generate an antibody or a T cell response. That simple. Here are some of the other ones. We're not going to go in detail on this because of the nature of this course, but you could spend some time looking at it, and I think it would be very, very informative. And I would highly recommend, as you open up your vaccine pamphlet, that you spend a little bit of time looking at the type of vaccine. As a general reminder, when we give a vaccine, we're looking for antigen-presenting cells to uptake the antigen or the pathogen or the antigen and process it, present it to B and T cells. That's going to activate either one of two things: a B cell response, which is generation of antibodies, or we have T helper cells, TH cells, which can then facilitate specific immune responses, including uptake of macrophages, neutrophils, activating certain B cells, isotype switching. And then the other side is we have cell-mediated T helper or cytotoxic T cell support, which kills virus-affected cells. So those are the mechanisms by which we're looking for. And each vaccine can have one or more of those responses that can be activated in order to fight. They're also capable of going sideways in a vaccine and having adverse events that are associated with those types of responses. So it's important to remember that as we talk about autoimmunity generated from a vaccine, because we had generated autoantibodies. We could also have T cells, which are generated like a hypersensitivity response. So these are all part of adverse events that can be associated with vaccines. Having said that, look at all these diseases. We've done a really good job of mitigating the effects, and we're getting better and better every single day. I've been part of herpes vaccines that are now starting to become really interesting and efficacious, and also part of some of the herpes virus, I should say. So we have CMV. There's an EBV vaccine that's coming out. We're talking about other vaccines that are more difficult to generate antibody response to or generate an immune response. and effectively control. And we're starting to see these come out due to new technologies like the mRNA vaccines, some of the nanoparticle-based vaccines, so, and some of the vector-based vaccines. Okay, so this is a quick reminder. The primary antigen presentation, we get a very strong response, but the secondary response is almost always stronger. And how that translates is, besides having greater durability commonly, you will see that sometimes we have a very strong, and the immune system is capable of processing and removing the pathogen or toxin. Sometimes we also get a stronger adverse event. So secondary responses are more rigorous and more rapid than the primary response. Super important concept to note, because as you give a vaccine and you're sitting there talking with your patient you need to be very cognizant of what can happen on a secondary dosing. Let's talk about the principles of correlates of protection. Correlates of protection are the immune response that is statistically correlated with protection. If you're diving deep on this topic, just note here are there's 9 actual principles of correlative protection. I've kind of highlighted some of the important ones that you will face. The vaccination correlative protection may not necessarily be the correlative protection for recovery from infection. Meaning, if I give you a vaccine, the vaccine is going to fight it off a certain way. That may not be, if you actually have a breakthrough infection, that may not be the same mechanism that gives you recovery from the infection. Super important detail, and sometimes you can those overlap, and sometimes you get multiple correlates of protection. These are mainly effector functions, which we talked about earlier when we talked about T helper cells, antibodies, and CD or CTL cytotoxic T cells, CD8 positive cells. A large challenge dose can overcome the best correlative protection, and this was more. There's tons of examples of this. But the most simple one is that most of you probably can relate to is COVID. There's tons of people who got the vaccine and they got infected. If you're in an office building, you're in a school, if you're sleeping with, next to your partner who's just breathing out large amounts of the virus, the challenge dose can overcome any vaccine. It can overcome the best correlative protection. So it can overwhelm your antibodies. It can overwhelm your CD8 positive cells just by the dosing that you give to it. Super important concept, very rarely understood, or very poorly understood commonly. Antibodies must be functionally neutralizing or sterilizing. High titers alone are not sufficient. So sometimes we get these high titers and the assays are not necessarily reflective of the protective ability of that immune response. So very important that you understand that concept. You can be befuddled very easily. And that happens just because the neutralization effect or sterilizing effect of those antibodies is not high enough or effective enough against that pathogen. More than one correlative protection may be available and even necessary, especially considering at certain stages you can have a lot of problems. So if we get a T help, let's say we have a strong antibody response and a strong Th1 cell response because it's viral, which are intracellular pathogens, we may be relying on antibodies at first, and it may switch over to Th1, and then it may switch over again to CD8 positives as the infection progresses and you're fighting different, and all three can also fight together. So these are things that happen that are important as we traverse an infection or fight off an infection. These are some of the more important correlates of protection that you'll probably need to be aware of. Okay, so talk about how we actually make vaccines. And the reason you'll hear about this all the time, especially with the COVID vaccines, we took shortcuts. We took no shortcuts in the COVID vaccine. What we did is we de-risked it. So these are some of the stages, preliminary stages. These are discovery. Then we go into animals. Clinical trial phase 1 is a safety, a small 200 or 20 to 100 healthy volunteers take the vaccine, and we just assess for health. We do look for efficacy, but it's not obviously as important as phase 2, where we talk about immunogenicity, which is basically a surrogate for efficacy. Is it safe and effective? And so we'll look at safety, and we'll look at the immune response. We'll look at the immunogenicity as a surrogate for effectiveness, and we'll see in several hundred patients whether the vaccine actually works. If it does work and it's safe, then we go into much larger, where we take thousands of healthy volunteers and we run them through safety, immunogenicity, and then we go to efficacy, where we actually see how they're responding to the actual pathogen in real life. And sometimes it's really challenging because we have vaccines we have infectious diseases we're developing vaccines for that are not really all that prevalent, and that can be very challenging to work through in a phase 3. We notice that there's interaction with regulatory agencies all the way through this process, and you have to get approvals to move on and actually continue the trials. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about when we talk about vaccines, we're balancing efficacy versus safety. Let's talk about efficacy first, and then we'll talk about safety, and then we'll talk about the interchange of the two. Efficacy is commonly the term we use in clinical trials. When we're done with clinical trials and it's been approved, we talked about effectiveness. The difference is efficacy is sometimes can be somewhat sterile, and we're not always looking at full-blown endpoints endpoints are the measures by which we evaluate a vaccine. So sometimes we'll look at high titers. Well, that's a surrogate for effectiveness. It's not really effectiveness. So efficacy occurs in clinical trials is what we're measuring, and effectiveness is after. And commonly we get this confused. This is something you should know. You probably may have tripped you up on the boards. If a vaccine has 80% efficacy, it does not mean the vaccine will work 80% of the time, right? It means that in a vaccinated population, 80% fewer people will contract the disease when they are exposed to the pathogen. So those are really subtle but important differences. So if we vaccinate people, we will have 80% fewer people that contract the disease. Contrast that with vaccine safety. We talk about adverse reactions and we talk about vaccine injury. And there's types of vaccines of common vaccine-related adverse events. So we have increasing severity. There's localized increasing severity of 2 to 3, which is moderate, 4, which is basically hospitalization, and 5 is death. So as we're giving a vaccine, we can see over time, we can see localized redness, itching, swelling. It doesn't really affect your everyday activities. So in a grade 2 adverse event, we're starting to see, visual disturbances, lighthead, syncope, all these kind of things. And so some of these can disrupt your daily activities. Step 3, anaphylaxis. We're starting to get into some serious stuff here. You're briefly hospitalized, and you're going to have to watch all the different measures for a little extended period of time. Some people get neurological conditions, autoimmune conditions that persist for a while, and some people pass away from vaccines. At this stage of the game, we don't commonly see death occurring at any rate above background. And so for the most part, we don't see grade 5. Does it happen? Absolutely, it happens. And so we have to be cognizant of some of the things like dengue can have some unintended adverse events, and we have to approach those very seriously, obviously. One of the things that happens is we use surrogates for efficacy in clinical trials. Immunogenicity is the measurement of immune response generated after a person is vaccinated. These are titers, right? So basically, you're going to be looking at how much antibody response, and sometimes they're neutralized and sometimes they're not. A lot of times we use these terms interchangeably, and they're not exactly the same thing. Efficacy actually is the measure of the decrease in likelihood of getting infection after being vaccinated. You can see the subtle differences. Immunogenicity is associated with a measure like titers. Efficacy is actually real world. Does this thing prevent diseases? And we use them interchangeably, especially in phase 1 and phase 2 of clinical trials, as a surrogate. And they're not necessarily overly the same. Not everyone who gets a vaccine generates an effective immune response in 3 ways. So we talked about one already, the correlates of protection. Dr. Town and I actually wrote a paper on this where we described what a tertiary vaccine failure was. This is where you generate in high titers, but it's non-neutralizing. So you generate an effective immune response, but it doesn't actually control because the antibodies don't bind sites that can actually handle the disease. We have secondary immune response or secondary vaccine failure where we needed to boost sooner. So across time, this is called the durability of a vaccine. When you give or persistence of a vaccine, if you give a vaccine, you generate high neutralizing titers, high neutralizing cellular response, T cells. Across time, that's going to wane. You're not exposed to it again. And we need to boost her. So if we don't boost her before we are infected, that's a secondary vaccine failure. And then a primary vaccine failure is when we don't generate enough titers at all. This can happen based on HLA type. It can be based on immunocompromised situations. It can be based on several factors, but this is probably the worst. And 5 to 10% of people do not generate effective immune responses for these reasons. I actually had a secondary vaccine failure to hepatitis, to one of my hepatitises, where I got the titers again, and I had I had my titers taken after the when I needed to, or when I was starting to work at Rocky Vista, and I had no titers, and I had to go back and redo the hepatitis vaccine. So that happens to a lot of us. This another example of this is we know that we commonly give a vaccine, a booster to tetanus every 8 years. If you were generating every 6 years instead, if your immune response was not durable or only durable to 6 years, you would have a secondary vaccine failure if you got exposed in year 7 or 8, for instance, before you got your booster. So again, I kind of briefly mentioned this. This is a little more detailed. So every vaccine has common adverse events, and they're graded again 1 through 5. This only shows 4 because 5 is death, but pain, and you can see that pain, mild, does not interfere with daily activity. 2, moderately interferes with activity. 3, prevents daily activity. 4, you're hospitalized, and that's associated with pain. We measure it on tenderness. We measure it on erythema or redness or induration. So, and we also can measure it in numerous other factors and grade in numerous extra factors that range from mild to death. Mild, moderate, severe, life-threatening, death. So, and this does not interfere, interferes, prevents, hospitalization is commonly a good way of thinking about it. Every vaccine, I have talked with fourth years numerous times. They have no idea about this concept, which is the vaccine injury table. Every vaccine, especially childhood, have a list of common adverse events that can occur, the time frame, and commonly you'll have very diagrammable treatment options. So tetanus toxoid has anaphylaxis commonly. You'll see that within the first 4 hours. There's actually quite a few that have this, and so does tetanus also does brachial neuritis, 2 to 28 days. So as you get into this, if you have a patient who has and this table is really, I love this version of the table. Actually, the CDC presents one that's pretty straightforward, and it just lists, it's like an Excel table, and it just lists all the vaccines and potential injuries and conditions. This is a lot more readable in my book, so you can use this however you want. Every adverse event you need to put in to vaccine adverse reporting system. Anybody can put into this. So a lot of times people will quote out of this, and it's not necessarily, it's a passive system, and it's also very not very rigorously evaluated. So mild, grade 1s and 2s are commonly just ignored, and they're underreported. We're really concerned about grade 3, 4, and 5, and VAERS does a pretty solid job of that. So people will commonly use the argument that VAERS is underreported and there's not telling as much. Well, that's true on 1 and 2, because if you have your erythema, a mild case of erythema, you're not going to report it. So, and you shouldn't. I mean, I shouldn't say you shouldn't. You don't need to. You can, and I would encourage a lot of people to do that. But you don't. It's not necessarily done a lot. VAERS is a super important way of presenting. After COVID, we generated vSafe, which is a active system, meaning they actually go out and ask you how you're doing at certain time points after you've been given the vaccine. So, and these both have different functions, but just be aware that we're doing this, and we do track adverse events quite rigorously. The reason this, I'm not going to go over in great detail this slide. I do in the vaccine elective, but I just want to highlight a couple of points. We have lots of global signal evaluations that exist. You'll see those in the light blue in the corner here. There's a global vaccine safety data net. So it's really, really important. One of the important precursors to this is the Brighton collaboration, which will define a case that's got a identifiable mechanism of injury from the vaccine, as well as define all of the diagnostic and all of the treatment options and all kinds of other things associated with that case. So for myocarditis, they produced a very lengthy report that gave all the details, the diagnostic criteria for whether it should be associated with the vaccine. It's very, very helpful in doing this, and Brighton Collaboration spent a great deal of time writing these reports up. And so you can find these reports, and they're very, very effective and helpful. There are common contraindications to vaccine. If you have acute febrile illness, if you're on immunosuppressive therapies, if you've had recent whole blood or plasma treatments, if you're giving, sometimes you can give two vaccines together that are not effective. And so you need to be aware of those contraindications for giving two vaccines together. If you have an immunodeficiency class, pregnancy, that really annoys me, because a lot of times for pregnant women, someone happens to be pregnant during a vaccine trial, and that's what we consider an important part. We need to do better here. Just saying that we shouldn't get vaccinated during pregnancy is not a valid option. We need to be more proactive in there. Obviously, we want to make sure the mom and the baby are healthy, but right now we're not being proactive in addressing that problem, and we definitely need to be. If you have leukemia or lymphoma, if you're immunosuppressed, if you have hypersensitivities to various vaccine components, and generally I would ask every patient if they have certain allergies, and certain age groups are not always warranted to get vaccines. So for HPV, it's generally under 45 as an example, whereas like shingles is for people over 50. And so there's general contraindications. The place to find contraindications is in your package insert. So in every vaccine, they have a little sheet. The information in there is golden. And I would highly recommend that before you give a vaccine, you spend 5 minutes and read that and get a good idea of what you're looking for. One of the things you're going to find in there is the components of the vaccine. So we have our active ingredients. These are basically the antigens, right? And so, commonly they can be toxoids or viruses or bacteria or recombinant proteins or mRNA. Those are the active ingredients that they're gonna generate the appropriate B or T cell response and function to generate the long-term durability that you need. Secondly, we can see adjuvants. So for a lot of vaccines, we do not have a signal 2, as you might recall from IHL. We have B7-CD8. Adjuvants actually stimulate the immune system to think that there's an infection. Without that, we can actually go into anergy. So adjuvants actually confuse the body to think that there is an infection, and we should generate a strong immune response to it. That's super important. One of the things that also happens is adjuvants can also can cause reactogenicity, meaning they're obviously stimulating the immune response, and sometimes they do a much better job of stimulating immune response, and sometimes there can be a lot of consequences due to that. We have antibiotics and stabilizers, which prevent contamination and the stability of that. So if you have some stabilizers in there, commonly things like monosodium glutamate, carbohydrates, inorganic salts, these commonly stabilize the proteins. We also have preservatives. This is where thimerosal comes in. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And we also have trace elements from manufacturing. Again, stabilizers reduce the thermal degradation of active ingredients. Most vaccines currently are protein-based, and just by thermodynamics, they're going to degrade. And so what we do is we put in certain carbohydrates, certain proteins in to stabilize that and make sure that the thermal degradation does not occur. Commonly, we also need to put vaccines at low temperatures, which is difficult in certain places to keep temperature, keep the vaccines at low temperature. So again, we have polysaccharides, collagens, food additives are very common vaccine stabilizers. We do have trace elements of things, and you will hear people talk about this. Things like eggs. We talk about things like formaldehyde. All these things are in such sufficiently low doses that for most people, they are not going to cause a problem. The doses are not harmful, and the antibiotics are common. The artifacts are very common ingredients commonly, or they're at such low doses that they do not matter. Adjuvants, again, stimulate the immune system, and there's tons of examples here. Most of them are aluminum. Most of the adjuvants these days are aluminum. So you're also going to see things like CpG, alum, which is also a dinucleotide DNA, and it's conjugated with aluminum, and dendritic cells uptake antigens much more effectively in this environment. Things like live virus and mRNAs do not necessarily need an adjuvant that you commonly see. They already signal up. Some of the nanoparticles in mRNA vaccines stimulate the immune system on their own, and so do live viruses. So they don't necessarily need those. Let's talk a little bit about thimerosal, which is a preservative, because it's one of the most commonly argued problems. Thimerosal was linked with in a debunked paper by Andrew Wakefield in 2000, or in the late 1990s. And the truth is that he had bias, and he performed a poor study that was published in the Lancet. The anti-vaxxers took this information and ran with it, and you'll still hear today that vaccines cause autism, even though in 2001 we removed thimerosal from all childhood vaccines. But yet the argument persists. So it's an organomercury. I can spend all day talking about this, but it's an ethyl mercury that's not commonly, it's very easily processed by our bodies. The harmful form of mercury is methyl mercury. That is harmful, whereas ethyl mercury we have no known problems with. Even today, this very day, I had a debate on Facebook with people, and aluminum. This is it's the most common adjuvant, and but people think it's neurotoxic. You have to have extremely high doses. The people who have aluminum neurotoxicity work in like aluminum plants and are inhaling and inadvertently digesting the stuff at very high doses. You're not going to get it from a vaccine. In fact, breast milk and infant formula have significantly higher dosing than a vaccine. So you're going to get higher doses through that. Plus, it transfers through much easier in the gut mucosal. So we have 90 years of widespread aluminum use in vaccines and medical applications, but it's also used very commonly in things like deodorant, and very safely used. So they commonly will say it causes autoimmunity, neurological. I saw this one today, long-term inflammation, type 1 diabetes, autism, Alzheimer's. I don't discount that completely. I think we need to be a little bit open, but the preponderance of evidence shows no problem with aluminum as an adjuvant. One of the newer adjuvants is AS01. You'll see this is used in Shingrix and some of the Novavax vaccines. These things are emerging. They are much higher reactogenicity. One of the main advantages of AS01 is that it can polarize your immune system to specific responses. So you can see AS01 in combination, which is MPL, which is a lipopolysaccharide from the Salmonella minnesota bacteria. It stimulates a TLR response, and it also is from QS21. So there's a typo on there. QS21 is a CD4 positive response, and MPL is a CD8 positive. And so these are polarizing agents. They are highly reactive, or not highly, but they do a really good job at a higher rate of generating reactogenicity. So the safety profile is strong, and it's safe, but it's highly reactogenicity. So it has high reactogenicity, meaning you are going to see some adverse events that may not be common. Allergies are a concern as we give this one, for anaphylaxis. So if we 1 in a million doses, we're going to see an anaphylaxis reaction. And if you've ever experienced an anaphylaxis patient in real life, it is absolutely terrifying. And so we want to keep our eyes peeled. Common things that you're going to see reactions to in vaccines are eggs, antibiotics, the gelatin, and latex. So these are the common things. Recently, we've discussed some of the other preservatives, some of the other additives also are generating responses like polyethylene glycol, which sounds like antifreeze, and people will commonly refer to as antifreeze. It is not. It's in a polymerized form. Ethylene glycol is not the same thing. So I want to just reiterate this again. Everything is dosing, and natural does not mean good, and dosing is personal based on our pharmacogenomics. And so when we talk about this, are there people who could be harmed by aluminum? Yes, because everything is personal. Dosing is personal. But you have to be cognizant that for most people, these are not going to be problems, and that you need to be cognizant of what that is. I mentioned this earlier. I want to reiterate this. Adverse events are stronger after and during a booster shot. So be very cognizant of that as you kind of do that. One of the common mRNA vaccine arguments, anti-vax arguments that you're going to hear is mRNA vaccines modify our genetic code. There is a possibility of this happening if you are infected with a retrovirus at the same time as you were given an mRNA. That is an extremely remote possibility. So never say never. I would highly encourage you to change your vernacular when it comes to vaccine safety. Not everything is perfectly safe, as sometimes is portrayed by the healthcare and the media. And that is simply not true. We do have adverse reactions. Are they rare? Yes, they're very rare, but that doesn't mean zero. So, but you also have to balance that with the fact that if it smells like a horse, looks like a horse, it is a horse. So you need to be cognizant of those kind of things. So if the vaccine is safe, it's safe. So mRNA vaccines like Pfizer can cause cancer. There is no way to argue this because it's years in the future, but effectively, because there's no way you can disprove this. But there's a couple of things to take into consideration. Toxins are minimal in all vaccines, so the probability is not high that it's going to cause cancer. And dosing is super important. So let's transition a little bit and talk about schedules. We're just jamming right along here. And I know that this is probably getting a little bit overwhelming, and these are deep topics we're discussing in 5 or 10 minutes. There's a vaccine schedule for children. Highly recommend that every child follows this vaccine. There's also a catch-up, which we'll talk about here, catch-up immunizations if they get behind schedule. That's why this is blurry, but you can find numerous copies of this on every year. The CDC will come out with this, and it tells you exactly at what months and what time points you should be vaccinating your child. And it looks like a lot, and it is. So, but the important part here is that we are educating our patients on what some of these vaccines do and why they're important and when they need to come in. You can obviously see this can be very problematic from a adherence perspective, what we refer to as uptake in the vaccine vernacular. So super important that you're very cognizant of when babies and children are supposed to be given vaccines. There's an adult version of this as well. So as you get in your family med and peds rotations, be cognizant that you need to be aware of that. There are minimum intervals that you need to be cognizant of. So we commonly, if we're giving a 3-dose booster, you hit certain milestones like times 0, week 3 or 4, and 8 months. So just be very cognizant that you shouldn't be messing around with those. You can go longer if you need to, but you should never go shorter because the recommended are designed to optimize your immune response. So it does not impair longer, but you definitely need to be very cognizant if you need to be going shorter. And sometimes this occurs when you have emergency travel and stuff like that. Just be cognizant of efficacy might be problematic. There is a catch-up schedule that I mentioned earlier. Sometimes it becomes necessary if they're behind schedule, if they have impending international travel, and so you may have to do that. This is an approved way of doing it because you can't just willy-nilly give vaccines. A schedule is necessary, especially at the younger ages. Every vaccine gets tracked in VTRACs. So every vaccine given nationwide, if you want to look this up, it's state by state, jurisdiction by jurisdiction. So as long as your patient is staying within a state, you can actually identify what vaccines are being given and have been given, unless that site is not competent, because they should be, after every vaccine, uploading what vaccine they gave you. So you can look in the system for, Joe, Susie, Preetha. You can look in the system and find them and identify when they got the vaccine and what type they got and what their gaps are, if you can't find a written record. A couple of resources that are super important as you kind of get into this. The Red Book, which is the report on the Committee on Infectious Diseases, it does talk about, and it's the most in-depth resource on childhood vaccines. They give webinars and other continuing educations. I would highly recommend. They tell a lot of drug interactions, international travel, responses that you can look for. Another one is the Yellow Book. The other Red Book is done by the Pediatrics, American Academy of Pediatrics. The Yellow Book is produced by the CDC. This is international travel. It's published every 2 years. So you can sit down and say, oh, if someone's going on a traveling out of the country, you can actually identify which vaccines you should be given, and they get revised and updated, and that they have the most current health guidelines. Two other resources highly recommend, especially if you're giving a vaccine for the first time. Watkins Vaccines gives history, gives a lot of great detail about the vaccines. This is in our library. Excellent resource. Anytime you get a vaccine, I would highly recommend you just read that book chapter on the vaccines. That book is extremely detailed. The CDC also publishes a book, Epidemiology and Prevention of Vaccine Preventable Diseases, also an excellent resource. If you're giving a lot of vaccines, you also may consider using, there's a MMWR. I should know what it means. It's a weekly report on the infectious diseases by the CDC. I'd highly recommend it. It's an email version. I peruse it very commonly, and it gives a detailed description of what kind of issues epidemiological we're facing as a country in infectious disease. Okay. I know we're cruising. A couple other thoughts before we get into the kind of one of the more keystone elements of this lecture. Vaccines trade off between safety and efficacy. And I mentioned that earlier, but with a subunit vaccine, which are more safe but less efficacious. And you say, well, we always want to be more efficacious. Well, we actually balance these pretty effectively. So we definitely, especially for childhood, we want safer vaccines, because most of the diseases we're fighting do not have a high prevalence within. And so safety is more important. If we have a very prevalent disease, something that's really, we want the ultimate in safety, or the ultimate in efficacy. And we'll sacrifice a little safety because the consequences can be severe. But the flip side is also true. If we have low prevalence, then safety concerns become more paramount. So these things are balanced out as we consider which vaccines in public health. Now, what may not be aware, there's patients who may not be aware of this, and they're going to use personal anecdotes to describe this. So this is somewhat outdated. I think COVID has changed this, but I'll explain to you where I think things have kind of changed. So there's going to be people who accept all vaccines, right? These are about a third of the people. We're going to have some acceptance, but there's going to be a little bit of doubt, a little bit of consternation, but they're ultimately probably going to accept them. We have people who are going to accept, but they may delay. Some even refuse. And then this is where we start getting into the fun. So these are what we classify as vaccine hesitant people, right? And then we have vaccine refusers, people who will not take the vaccine, but don't really go outside of themselves to espouse any principles of why. And then we have the vaccine deniers. And these people are actively trying to recruit other people. As we get into this, it's important to recognize your patient on this continuum, where they are, because honestly, you're not going to change a vaccine denier's mind very effectively. You can present information and give them the option to choose choice, but I would not waste a lot of my time in this process with vaccine deniers. Some would argue, in fact, I would argue, that vaccine refusers are in the same boat. You may have to spend a little more time with them, but honestly, there's a low probability of you convincing them. So one of the reasons this is, as Peter Parham noted, as people's fears of vaccines abate, their concerns for the side effects of the vaccine increase. So side effects, this is a function of being safe and our times and the effective vaccines we've created. We are experiencing decreasing vaccination rates. And so right now, or in 2010, it was 3%. I bet that's going up dramatically in the last little bit. So, and in certain communities, they're especially high. So there are states that allow more exemptions than others. And so you have to be cognizant of what's going on in your community as far as mandates and as far as reasons why. We'll talk a little bit about reasons why in a little bit, but just recognize that we lose confidence after a period of time from an outbreak. And so we start losing our ability to assess the risk effectively. Some people can't even assess the risk effectively in real time. There's a good chunk of people who especially can't do it across times. So how do we identify? So we're focusing on the vaccine hesitant, vaccine refusers, vaccine deniers. We're just gonna recognize them and chalk them up to, we're probably not convinced them. We present the facts, present the options, we give our opinion, we move on. Vaccine hesitant people, we need to identify, or it's most effective if you identify the reasons for their hesitation, because then we can start talking about that and allowing them to go through motivational interviewing steps, which may be helpful. So there's 3 negative and 2 somewhat positive aspects, different factors that are associated with vaccine hesitancy. So confidence is associated with a trust in vaccines, and this is often manifested in, I don't trust the government type mentality. So, or anti-big pharma. We're not confident in the policymakers, the deliverers, the manufacturers of that. So that's a confidence thing. Complacency, there's just like, I don't really see a need. This is very common in influenza where I don't really have any side effects, so I'm not really gonna. And these are extremely challenging. We'll talk about them in that motivational interviewing. But some of these people who have low risk and other life, health, and responsibilities, or have other priorities at the time, can often be very difficult and challenging. We also have convenience. And these are structural, affordability, and psychological. So they can be social norms on the psychological front, appeal, or constraints. Structural are things like access, availability to healthcare, affordability. And you'll also see things like, well, I'm not going to vaccinate my kids because if they have a bad reaction, I cannot get to work. Because I can't have time off. I don't have any time off. I need to, if I do, then rent is going to be a problem. So you'll see things like that. And so we have to sit down and assess these things and understand them, be empathetic, and try to help the patient overcome them. We also have calculation, which is engagement and extensive information gathering. This can be a positive. It can also be negative, but generally it's a positive. And then essentially they're listening to us as the healthcare provider. And then we have a collective response. And then I just tell people this doesn't mean anything anymore. I used to tell people that it was worth something. I think I was wrong, to be honest with you. I don't think it's ever been important. I think we are very self-centered and self-focused. And I don't want to sound cynical, because I'm not, because there will be people who pick up on this, but the willingness to protect others is a very minimal component in vaccine hesitancy. So very important to be able to identify the type, where they are on the spectrum, whether they're hesitant, refusal, or denial. And then it helps as we get into motivational interviewing to understand the components and what the primary motivation behind that anti-vaccine is. Some of the reasons that also that deserve a little more attention, we can have religious reasons, which is really challenging because it becomes part of their identity. We'll talk about this a little bit more in motivational interviewing. We can have personal or philosophical reasons. We can have safety concerns, more information, lack of trust. They need more information. So things that can help. And this will transition us over nicely to motivational interviewing. We can do surveys of parents found that 80% of the primary healthcare provider provide positive influence on decision to get vaccine. That commonly manifests as the healthcare provider confidently assuming that the person is going to get vaccinated. I'd love to see this post-COVID, but commonly, if you're just going to assume that people doesn't give them a door to which to express their hesitancy. And you can influence by having a solid discussion. Sometimes mandates work for school-age children, I don't know these days if that's as true as that used to be. So, okay. Really happy that you were able to view this. The next phase of this is we're going to talk about how to do motivational interviewing. We provided a strong foundation for you to build off of in this quick lecture. And I would encourage you to look at the resources that we outlined if you get stuck and you don't quite know. There's things that I still don't know and look up all the time. Your clinical tools are excellent, up to date, Dynamed, Visual DX, the CDC resources are excellent, Plotkins are excellent. There's tons of resources at which you can go find information. This is a very dynamic situation. Like I said, even today, there's one or two conditions that I was like, I need to look this up a little further to see in order to have a discussion with somebody. So, all right, we'll see you on the next lecture. I hope you enjoyed, and I would very much enjoy chatting with you if you have any questions about this topic.